June 18th, 1815. The wood and the high brick walls of Hougoumont, a walled farm and château on the far right of the Duke of Wellington's line, a little south of the village of Waterloo. The rain had stopped in the night, but the ground was a swamp, and the air still smelled of wet rye and wood smoke. From the French lines across the shallow valley, the place looked like nothing at all. A cluster of farm buildings, an orchard heavy with unripe fruit, a formal garden behind a wall, a small gray chapel. To the staff officers gathered around the emperor that morning, the château was a detail, a nuisance on the flank, to be swept aside in the opening hour to draw Wellington's reserves down from the ridge, while Napoleon broke the center and won, as he had always won. Inside those walls waited the light companies of the Coldstream and the 3rd Foot Guards, under a tall, taciturn Scot named Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell. Perhaps 2,000 defenders in all, with support, against a French wing that would, before the day was done, swell to some 14,000 men. The arithmetic was an insult. The French infantry forming up in the wood below could be forgiven for laughing at the task in front of them. A farmhouse. How long could a farmhouse hold? What neither Napoleon nor the men he sent forward yet understood was that this farmhouse would not fall, that the diversion meant to last an hour would devour an entire wing of the French army for 9, that the emperor would feed battalion after battalion into the orchard and the wall and the burning buildings, and get nothing back but his own dead. And it would come down to a gate, 2 heavy wooden doors on the north side, and a handful of guardsmen throwing their shoulders against them, while a French axeman hacked at the timber from the other side. Wellington himself would later say the whole battle turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. This is the story of that day, the day Napoleon's army laughed at a farmhouse, and a few hundred guardsmen made an empire pay for every inch of it. To understand why a farm mattered enough to swallow 14,000 men, you have to understand how Napoleon had come to be standing in that Belgian field at all. 11 weeks earlier, he had not been an emperor. He had been an exile on the island of Elba, a sovereign of olive groves and a few hundred guards. Then, in late February 1815, he slipped his keepers, landed in the south of France with a handful of men, and walked north toward Paris. The soldiers sent to arrest him changed sides and followed him instead. By the 20th of March, he was back in the Tuileries, and the king who had replaced him had fled. The powers of Europe, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, refused to negotiate. They declared not war on France, but war on him personally, and began assembling the largest coalition armies the continent had ever seen. Napoleon's only hope was speed. If he waited, he would be crushed by sheer numbers from every direction. So he gambled. He would strike north into the Kingdom of the Netherlands, modern Belgium, where 2 allied armies lay dangerously close together, but not yet joined. The Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, and Marshal Blucher's Prussians. If Napoleon could wedge his army between them and beat them one at a time, he might shatter the coalition before Austria and Russia ever reached the Rhine. On the 16th of June, it nearly worked. At Ligny, Napoleon mauled Blücher and drove the Prussians from the field. The old marshal was ridden over by cavalry and very nearly killed. The same afternoon, at a crossroads called Quatre Bras, Wellington fought Marshal Ney to a standstill and then, learning of the Prussian retreat, pulled back northward through a thunderstorm so violent that men remembered the rain as a kind of second enemy. He stopped on a low ridge in front of the village of Waterloo, on the road to Brussels, and turned to fight, but only on one condition, a promise carried to him through the storm, that Blücher, beaten as he was, would march to join him the next day. That promise is the key to everything that happened at Hougoumont. Wellington's plan on the 18th was not to win in the morning. It was to survive the morning, to hold his ridge against everything Napoleon could throw at it, bleeding the French army hour by hour, until the Prussians arrived from the east and fell on Napoleon's flank. Waterloo, for the Allied army, was an endurance test with a deadline, and an endurance test is won or lost at its anchor points. Wellington built his line around 3 of them. In the center, a farm called La Haye-Sainte sat astride the Brussels road. On the left, the hamlets of Papelotte and La Haye watched the approaches from the east, the very direction the Prussians would come. And on the right, forward of the ridge and slightly below it, stood the château and farm of Hougoumont, a breakwater thrust out in front of Wellington's most vulnerable flank. It was vulnerable for a reason that had nothing to do with the farm itself. Fearing that Napoleon might try to slip around his right and cut the road to the coast, Wellington had detached some 17,000 men miles away to the west, near the town of Hougoumont, to guard against a flanking move that never came. Those men would stand idle all day. It meant the right of his real line was thinner than he would have liked, and Hougoumont was the cork in the bottle. So long as Guardsmen held those walls, no French column could safely advance up that side of the field without taking fire into its flank from behind the loopholes. If the farm fell, the whole right of Wellington's army was exposed. The ridge could be turned, and the endurance test would be over long before any Prussian drum was heard. The men Wellington trusted with that cork were among the finest infantry in his army. The light companies of the Brigade of Guards, the Coldstream, second only to none, and in continuous service since 1650, and the 3rd Foot Guards, the regiment that would one day become the Scots Guards. Household troops of the British Crown, drilled to a hardness that visitors mistook for arrogance. In the hours before the first shot, they did not wait to be attacked. They knocked loopholes through the brick of the garden wall, built firing platforms from the farm's own timber, barricaded the gates, and turned a gentleman's country estate into a fortress. Then they waited, soaked and silent, for an empire to come and test the work. If you want to know why Hougoumont held, you have to walk it. The place was not a single building, but a small fortified world. At its heart stood the château itself, a tall brick house with a farm grouped tightly around it, a great barn, stables, a gardener's house, cow sheds, and a little chapel barely larger than a room. To the east of the buildings lay a formal walled garden, its brick wall standing well over the height of a man, and beyond that an orchard fenced by a hedge and a sunken lane. To the south, the side facing the French, was a wood, perhaps 300 meters deep, of mature trees and thick undergrowth. And piercing the whole complex were 2 ways in, a south gate opening toward the enemy, and on the far side the great north gate, the lifeline through which ammunition and reinforcement would have to come from Wellington's ridge. It was, in other words, a ready-made fortress that happened to look like a farm. And the Guardsmen who garrisoned it spent the wet morning making it more so. They loopholed the garden wall, knocking holes through the brick at chest height, so that 2 ranks could fire, one through the wall and one over it from firing platforms built of farm timber. They blocked the south gate. They cut firing slits in the barn. They felled trees across the lanes. By the time the French were ready, the south wall of that garden had become a single long, low gun line that no man could approach across open ground and live. The defense was not purely British, and an honest account says so. The wood and the orchard in front were first held by German troops, Hanoverian and Nassau soldiers, and a detachment of Lunenburg light infantry, skirmishers whose job was to make the French fight for every tree. The buildings in the walled garden, the hard core of the position, were held by the light companies of the Brigade of Guards, the Coldstream, and the 3rd Foot Guards under Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell, with the light companies of the 1st Foot Guards under Lord Saltoun contesting the orchard. In all, the garrison at the opening numbered perhaps 1,500 fighting men in and around the walls, with German support forward, a number that would rise through the day as Wellington fed in reinforcements he could barely spare. Against them, Napoleon committed the divisions of his 2nd Corps under Reille, beginning with the division of his own youngest brother, Prince Jérôme Bonaparte. As the morning wore on, Jérôme would pour in not just his leading brigades, but his entire division, and then draw in the divisions of Foix and Bachelou beside him, until a force that swelled toward 14,000 men was grinding itself against a garrison 1/10 its size. The asymmetry is the whole point of the story. Napoleon had ordered a feint. His brother turned it into an obsession. There is a grim irony in the orders that morning, because at least one French commander saw the danger plainly. Marshal Reille, who had fought the British in Spain, is said to have warned the Emperor about what well-posted British infantry could do to a frontal attack, that you could not simply walk over them, that they would stand behind their cover and shoot your columns to pieces. Napoleon, fresh from beating the Prussians 2 days before and certain of victory, did not heed him. The men forming up in the wet wood below Hougoumont were about to learn what Reille already knew. We know their names on both sides because the survivors wrote it all down. Macdonell, the tall Highlander who would command the buildings through 9 hours of fire. Corporal James Graham of the Coldstream, an Irishman from County Monaghan, whose name would become famous before the afternoon was out. Sergeant Ralph Fraser, Captain Henry Wyndham, and across the valley, the men of Jérôme's division stepping off into the trees, voltigeurs and grenadiers who had cheered the Emperor's return, and now found themselves ordered to take a farm that bristled with hidden muskets. It is worth pausing on the timing, because Hougoumont was not a sideshow that ran parallel to the battle. It opened the battle. The first serious shots of Waterloo were fired here, late in the morning. Most accounts put it around 11:30, when the French guns spoke and Jérôme's infantry pushed into the wood. Napoleon meant it as the curtain raiser, the diversion to draw Wellington's eye and reserves to his right before the real blow fell on the center. Instead, the curtain raiser would run the length of the play, and it began with a storm of skirmishers coming through the trees. It began, as these things do, with skirmishers. A little before 11:30, the French batteries opposite Hougoumont opened, and under the cover of that fire, the leading brigade of Jérôme's division pushed into the southern wood. They came in the loose, fast-moving swarm of the voltigeurs, light infantrymen trained to fight as individuals, flitting from tree to tree, picking their targets, using the ground. It was exactly the kind of fight the wood was made for, and exactly the kind of fight the defenders had been placed there to lose slowly. The Hanoverians and Nassars and the Lunenburg men holding the trees did what light troops are meant to do against overwhelming odds. They made the French pay for the ground and then gave it up, falling back from cover to cover toward the buildings behind them. For the men in green and the men in blue threading through that dripping wood, it was a murderous, intimate kind of war. A face appearing for an instant between trunks, a musket flash, a man down in the leaf mold, and the line edging forward over him. The undergrowth was thick, the visibility short, and the noise, the crackle of musketry rolling through timber, the shouted orders, the drums beating the pas de charge, funneled the French forward toward the one thing they could see clearly ahead, the southern wall of the garden and the buildings rising behind it. And then the wood ended. This was the moment the whole position had been built for. Between the edge of the trees and the wall lay a strip of open ground, a killing ground, and the French, carried forward by their own momentum and numbers, spilled out of the cover of the wood into it. Ahead of them, the long brick wall of the garden sat silent. Then the loopholes spoke. The volley that met them was not the ragged fire of skirmishers. It was the concentrated, disciplined musketry of guardsmen who had spent the morning preparing their fields of fire, and now stood 2 ranks deep behind brick, one firing through the loopholes, one over the top from the platforms they had built. At a range of a few dozen meters into a mass of men packed by the funnel of the wood, it was annihilating. The front of the French rush simply came apart. Men fell in heaps at the foot of the wall. Those behind recoiled into those still coming on, and the survivors broke back into the trees, leaving the open ground in front of the garden carpeted with their dead and wounded. It was the lesson Marshal Rey had tried to teach the Emperor that morning, delivered now in the only language the day would respect. You could not walk over British infantry behind cover. You could only die in front of them. But numbers are their own kind of weapon, and Jérôme had numbers. The repulse at the wall did not end the assault. It merely redirected it. If the southern wall could not be stormed head-on, the French would work around it, pushing west, around the edge of the buildings, probing along the flank of the complex for a way in. They drove the last of the German skirmishers out of the wood in the kitchen garden, swept around toward the western and northern faces of the farm, and for a few minutes the fighting lapped right up against the walls on 3 sides. Guardsmen fired down from upper windows and from behind the buildings. The French surged in the dead ground beneath them, looking for a door, a gap, a weakness. And there was one. On the north side of the complex, the side away from the enemy, the side nobody expected to be assaulted, the great wooden gates had been opened not long before to let a supply of ammunition and a party of men come in from the ridge. In the swirl of the French rush around the flank, a body of attackers found themselves driven, almost by accident, against that northern face. The gates had been pushed too, but not properly barred, and at their head was a giant. His name, as the French remembered it, was Sous-Lieutenant Legros, an officer of the 1st Light Infantry so big and so fierce that his own comrades had nicknamed him l'enfonceur, the smasher. He had caught up an abandoned axe, and as the knot of French infantry pressed against the timber and felt it give, Legros raised the axe over his head and swung it into the gates of Hougoumont. The whole battle, Wellington would say, turned on what happened next. The timber split, and the gates burst inward. Legros came through first, the axe still in his hands, and behind him poured a flood of French infantry, perhaps 30 or 40 men, light infantrymen and grenadiers who had seen the gap open and flung themselves at it. For a few heartbeats, the unthinkable had happened. The enemy was inside Hougoumont. They were in the north courtyard, the very heart of the position, with the buildings full of guardsmen around and above them. If that breach could be held open, if the men behind could pour through after the first wave, the farm was lost, and with it the cork in the bottle of Wellington's right. What happened in that courtyard lasted perhaps 2 minutes, and decided the rest. Lieutenant Colonel Macdonell saw the gates go and understood instantly that the only thing that mattered in the world was closing them again. He gathered the men nearest to him, a small group of officers and guardsmen, Coldstream and 3rd Guards together, and threw himself bodily against the open doors. It became a contest of sheer physical strength. A handful of men on the inside heaving the great timber leaves shut against the press of the French still trying to force them, while inside the courtyard the men who had already broken in were hunted down. The names that come down to us from that scrum are the names the regiment would carry like battle honors ever after. Macdonell himself, the tall colonel, his shoulder to the wood. Corporal James Graham, the big Irishman from County Monaghan, who stood beside him. Sergeants Brahma and McGregor, Ensign Henry Gooch, Captain Henry Wyndham, who put his weight to the gate, knowing it might be the last thing he ever did. Together they forced the leaves closed, and Graham, by the account that became famous, dropped the great crossbar back into place, sealing the breach. The French who had got inside were now trapped, cut off from their comrades by the very gates that had let them in, surrounded in a stone courtyard by an enemy on every side and above. They were killed almost to a man in a brief and pitiless fight among the farm buildings. Tradition holds that every Frenchman who entered the courtyard died there but one, a young drummer boy, spared on Macdonell's order. Legros, the smasher, the giant who had broken the gate, fell with the rest. The breach that might have ended the battle had been sealed in the space of a few minutes by a few men's shoulders against a door. Now, this is the moment to slow down and be honest, because this scene is the most famous thing the Guards ever did, and fame has a way of smoothing the edges off the truth. The closing of the gates is most often told as a Coldstream story, and Macdonell and Graham were Coldstream men. But the defense of the buildings was shared with the 3rd Foot Guards, the future Scots Guards, and modern archaeology has reasserted their part. When the team at Waterloo uncovered, excavated by the North Gate 2 centuries later, they found regimental buttons from both the Coldstream and the Scots Guards in the ground where the fighting happened. The men who shut that gate were guardsmen of more than one regiment, and both have a claim to the moment. Where the accounts of individual heroics differ, and they do, the wise course is to name the men the record's name, and to let the credit be shared, as the buttons in the soil say it should be. What is not in dispute is the importance of it. Wellington was not a man given to sentiment or exaggeration about his own battles. Yet when he looked back on the 18th of June, he fixed on this above almost everything else. The success of the battle, he said, turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. He meant it almost literally. Had the gate stayed open, had the French second wave got into that courtyard behind the first, the farm would very likely have fallen in the late morning, and the entire right of his line would have unraveled hours before Blücher's Prussians could arrive to save it. A few hundred guardsmen and a wooden door had just bought Wellington his afternoon. But Napoleon's brother was not finished. If the farm could not be taken through the gates, it would be taken some other way, by fire, by numbers, by sheer refusal to admit that a farmhouse could not be broken. The hardest hours at Hougoumont, were still to come. When brute force failed at the gates, Napoleon reached for fire. By early afternoon, the Emperor had seen enough of the farm that would not fall. He ordered up a howitzer battery and gave it a simple, brutal task. If the buildings could not be stormed, they would be burned down on top of the men holding them. Howitzers did not fire flat like field guns. They lobbed shells in a high arc, dropping them over walls and through roofs. And against a cluster of old timber and thatch farm buildings, their incendiary effect was devastating. The shells came down into the courtyards and the lofts, and Hougoumont began to burn. The fire took hold in the great barn, in the stables, in the château itself, and spread with terrible speed through the cramped heart of the position. And here the defense of Hougoumont became something close to a vision of hell. The Guardsmen were now fighting on two fronts at once, outward through the loopholes against a French infantry that kept coming, and inward against the flames eating through the very buildings they were defending. Smoke rolled through the courtyards thick enough to choke a man. Burning timbers fell. The roar of the fire mixed with the crackle of musketry and the screams of the wounded. The worst of it fell on the helpless. Many of the wounded of both sides, French and British and German, had been carried or had crawled into the barns and outbuildings for shelter, out of the storm of musketry. Now those buildings were alight. Men too badly hurt to move were trapped as the fire spread, and the defenders, fighting for their lives at the walls, could not reach them all. It is one of the most harrowing details of the whole battle, recorded by the men who were there and never forgotten by them. The cries of the wounded burning in the barns of Hougoumont, while the fight went on around them. Some were dragged clear by comrades who broke off from the firing line to haul them out of the flames. Many were not. And yet, this is the extraordinary thing, the thing that turns a horror into a feat of arms. The line held. A lesser garrison would have broken. The natural human thing to do when the building you are standing in catches fire and the enemy is at the wall is to get out, to fall back, to save yourself. The Guardsmen did not. They pulled back only from the buildings that were actually ablaze, and they kept manning the garden wall and the positions that still stood, firing out through the smoke at every French attempt to rush the walls under cover of the chaos. The fire that was meant to drive them out became just one more thing to be endured, like the rain and the artillery and the endless blue columns coming on through the trees. They held the perimeter while the center of their own fortress burned. There is a single image that survives from the inferno that has become, for the British Army, almost sacred. In the middle of the burning complex stood the little chapel of Hougoumont. As the fire swept through the buildings, it reached the chapel too, and the flames ran in through the door and licked up the wooden figure of Christ on the cross above it. And there, by the account passed down, the fire stopped. The crucifix was scorched at the feet and went no further. To the soldiers who saw it, exhausted and half-blinded by smoke, it seemed like a sign, and the story of the chapel that would not wholly burn became part of the legend of the place. What is certainly true is plainer and just as striking. When the long day was over and most of Hougoumont was a smoking ruin, the chapel was among the few things still standing. By mid-afternoon, then, the picture at Hougoumont was this. The buildings were burning or burnt. The courtyards were full of dead. The wounded had suffered horrors. And still the flag of the defense flew over the wall, and still the loopholes spat fire, and still every French assault washed up against the brick and recoiled. Jérôme had thrown in brigade after brigade. Foy and Bachelieu's men had been drawn into the fight beside him. A diversion meant to occupy a fraction of Wellington's army for an hour had by now sucked in the better part of 14,000 Frenchmen, and was holding every one of them fast, away from the great assaults Napoleon was launching against the ridge beyond. The farm was killing the French, not by beating them, but by refusing to die. And Wellington's afternoon, the afternoon he needed Blucher to fill, was being bought, brick by burning brick. Statistics tell you that Hougoumont held. They do not tell you what it cost the men who held it. For that, you have to come down off the ridge and into the smoke, to the level of individual men, and look at what the day asked of them one by one. Take the ammunition first, because it is the least romantic and most revealing detail of the whole defense. Men firing all day through loopholes burned through cartridges at a frightening rate, and a garrison sealed inside a burning fortress cannot make more. By the afternoon, the defenders were running low, and a position out of ammunition is a position about to fall, no matter how brave its garrison. The lifeline was the north gate, the same gate Legros had nearly broken, and the open ground behind it, swept by French fire. The resupply that saved Hougoumont has its own small legend. A private of the train, remembered as Joseph Brewer, is said to have driven a tumbrel of ammunition down from the ridge and through the contested ground to the north gate, lashing his horses through the fire to get the cartridges in. Whether by his hand or others, the ammunition got through, and the loopholes kept speaking. A wagon of cartridges delivered under fire was as decisive in its way as any bayonet. Now come back to the gate, and to the man who became the most famous guardsman of the battle, because his story carries the human cost better than any casualty return. Corporal James Graham of the Coldstream, the big Irishman who had stood with Macdonell at the gates, fought on through the afternoon as the buildings burned. By one account that the regiment treasured, in the middle of the fighting, Graham asked his commanding officer's permission to leave the firing line for a moment. It was an extraordinary request in the middle of a battle, and the reason was this. His brother, also a guardsman, lay wounded in one of the burning buildings, and Graham wanted to drag him out of the reach of the flames before he went back to his post. He pulled his brother clear, and then returned to the wall and kept fighting. That is the cost of Hougoumont in a single image. A man stepping out of the firing line to save his brother from the fire, and then stepping back into it. After the battle, the story of Graham acquired a curious afterlife that tells you how much the deed meant to the army. A clergyman, the Reverend John Norcross, left a bequest, a substantial sum for the time, to be given to one deserving private soldier of Wellington's army, the bravest man in England at Waterloo. Wellington was asked to name the man, and he turned to the commander at Hougoumont, who named James Graham. Graham received the pension, and when the money later ran out, the story goes, the honor of being the bravest man passed on, but Graham's name stayed fixed to it. The history here is genuinely tangled. The details of the bequest and who received what have been argued over ever since, and an honest telling says so. But the core of it is sound and revealing. When the army wanted to point to a single ordinary soldier and say, "This is what courage looked like at Waterloo," it pointed to a corporal who had helped shut a gate and pulled his brother from a fire. Multiply that by the hours. The men in Hougoumont were not asked to make one charge and have done with it. They were asked to stand in a burning farm from late morning until evening, perhaps 8 hours, and hold, while wave after wave came at them, while the buildings burned around them, while their friends fell at the loopholes beside them, and the wounded cried out from the flames they could not reach. Endurance of that kind is a different thing from the hot courage of an attack. It is colder and harder and it has to be renewed every single minute that the fight goes on. There is no momentum to carry you, no charge to lose yourself in. Only the wall, the next French rush, the dwindling cartridges, and the decision, made again and again, not to break. The casualty figures, when they came, were grim. Across the whole struggle for Hougoumont, the dead and wounded of both armies in and around that small patch of ground ran into the thousands. Most estimates put the combined toll above 6,000 men fighting over a farm and its garden and its wood. The garrison itself was gutted, and yet, at the end of it, the same flag flew over the same wall, and the same regiments held the same ground they had held at dawn. That is what it cost. The next question is what it bought. Because while Hougoumont burned, the real battle for the ridge above was reaching its crisis. To understand what Hougoumont was buying, you have to climb back up to the ridge and look at the battle as Napoleon was losing it. While Jérôme's men were dying in front of the garden wall, the Emperor launched the blow that was supposed to win the day. In the early afternoon, the massed infantry of d'Erlon's corps, perhaps 16,000 men in huge, deep columns, rolled forward against the left center of Wellington's line. For a moment, it looked as though the sheer weight of them would simply crush the thin Allied front. They came on through their own cannon smoke, drums beating, and broke into the forward positions. And then the British heavy cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, came down on them from the ridge in one of the most famous charges in the Army's history, and tore d'Erlon's great attack to pieces. Thousands of Frenchmen were killed or captured. 2 French eagles were taken. But the British horsemen, as they so often did, charged too far, blew their horses on the soft ground, and were cut to ribbons in their turn by French lancers and cuirassiers. The grand infantry assault had failed, at a price both sides felt. Then came the cavalry, and the strangest hours of the battle. In the middle of the afternoon, Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, the man who had held Wellington at Quatre Bras, convinced himself that the Allied line was breaking and launched the massed French cavalry against the ridge. Wave after wave of cuirassiers and lancers and the heavy horsemen of the Guard, thousands of them, thundered up the slope. Wellington's infantry formed square, those hollow boxes of men, bayonets bristling on every side. That cavalry could not break so long as the men inside held their nerve, and stood. The French horsemen broke around the squares like sea around rocks, unable to get in, shot down by volley fire, riding back and reforming, and coming on again and again. For hours the cavalry exhausted itself against the unbroken squares, achieving nothing but its own destruction, because Ney had sent it forward without the infantry and guns that might have made it tell. And through all of it, d'Erlon's failed columns, Ney's wasted cavalry, the long, murderous artillery duel, Hougoumont went on burning and holding on the right. This is the strategic heart of the whole story, and it is worth stating as plainly as the battle itself stated it. Napoleon's army was being bled to death by piecemeal effort. A great infantry attack here, a great cavalry attack there, each thrown in without proper coordination, each failing in turn. An army fighting that way needs above all to husband its reserves, to keep formed troops in hand for the decisive moment. And Napoleon could not, because a fraction of his army that should have been a feint had become a furnace that swallowed everything fed into it. Think of the arithmetic from the French side. Jérôme had been ordered to take Hougoumont with a brigade as a diversion, to draw down Wellington's reserves. Instead, hour by hour, he drew down his own. When the farm would not fall, he committed his whole division. When that was not enough, the divisions of Foix and Waterloo were sucked in beside him. By the late afternoon, the better part of 14,000 French soldiers, formed infantry that Napoleon desperately needed for the assault on the ridge, were pinned in the wood and the orchard and the open ground around a burning farm, held there by a garrison a fraction of their size. The diversion had reversed itself. Hougoumont was meant to draw Wellington's strength away from the center. Instead, it drew Napoleon's. And the clock was the thing. Remember Wellington's whole plan? Hold until the Prussians come. All afternoon, away to the east, Blücher's columns were grinding along muddy lanes toward the battlefield. And as they arrived, they began to fall on Napoleon's right flank at the village of Placmois, forcing the Emperor to peel off the young guard and then part of the old guard to hold them off. Every French soldier locked in front of Hougoumont was a soldier not available to break Wellington's center before that Prussian weight made itself felt. The farm was not just holding ground, it was holding time. And time was the one commodity Napoleon did not have. So the men at the wall, choking in the smoke, firing their dwindling cartridges, almost certainly could not see the larger truth of what they were doing. They thought they were holding a farm. In fact, they were holding the right flank of the army still. They were denying the Emperor the reserves he needed, and they were running out the clock on the French Empire, one repulsed assault at a time, until the hammer arrived from the east. That hammer was coming, and when the crisis of the whole battle finally broke, late in the day, Hougoumont was still in British hands. There is a way to measure exactly what the Guards achieved at Hougoumont, and it is this. Look at the strong point that did not hold. While Hougoumont burned and held on the right, another farm anchored the very center of Wellington's line. La Haye-Sainte, astride the Brussels road, the hinge of the whole position. It was held by a battalion of the King's German Legion, green-jacketed riflemen as steady as any troops on the field, under a major named George Baring. Their story is the dark mirror of Hougoumont. They fought with the same desperate courage. They held through assault after assault. And then, late in the afternoon, they ran out of ammunition. And unlike at Hougoumont, no resupply got through. The rifles fell silent, not because the men would not fire, but because they had nothing left to fire. And the French finally swarmed over the walls and took the farm by storm. Baring escaped with a handful of survivors. The center strong point had fallen. The consequences were immediate and nearly fatal. With La Haye-Sainte in French hands, Ney pushed artillery and skirmishers right up close to Wellington's center and began to blow holes in it at murderous range. For perhaps half an hour in the early evening, the Allied center was in real danger of breaking, the most perilous moment of the entire day for Wellington. Had Ney been given fresh infantry then, in that window, the line might have gone. But Ney had no fresh infantry to give, and now you see the two farms speaking to each other across the battlefield. La Haye-Sainte fell partly because it could not be reinforced or resupplied in time. Hougoumont did not fall, in large part, because it could be, because the North Gate, for all the fire sweeping the ground behind it, stayed in British hands, and the cartridges kept coming through. And the reserves that might have exploited the fall of the center, the formed infantry that Ney begged for and Napoleon could not send, were not there in the strength they should have been, because so many of them were still locked in the killing ground around Hougoumont, fighting a farm that would not die. The strong point that held on the right was, in a real sense, helping to pay for the crisis at the center. Wellington's line bent in the evening. It did not break, and the margin between bending and breaking was made up, brick by brick, of things like a held gate and a wagon of cartridges driven through fire. And then, from the east, the decision finally arrived. All day Blücher had been dragging his battered, exhausted Prussians across appalling country to keep the promise he had made to Wellington after Ligny, that he would come. Now they came in force. The fighting around the village of Plancenoit, on Napoleon's right rear, swelled into a battle of its own, savage and close, and it forced the Emperor to do the thing he could least afford, to feed his irreplaceable reserves away from the decisive front. He sent the Young Guard into Plancenoit, and then battalions of the Old Guard itself, to hold the Prussians back and keep his escape road open. The very troops that might have finished Wellington in the evening crisis were being burned up holding off Blücher in the east. So consider the position of the French army as the long day moved toward its climax. The great infantry assault had failed and been ridden down. The massed cavalry had wrecked itself against the squares. La Haye-Sainte had been taken, but too late and at too high a cost to exploit, because there were no fresh formations in hand to drive through the gap. The right flank was now bleeding men into Plancenoit against the arriving Prussians, and on the western flank 14,000 men were still entangled with a burning farm they had never managed to capture. Napoleon had one card left. He had been hoarding it all day. The finest infantry in the world, perhaps in history. The Imperial Guard, the men who had never been beaten in a major attack. The soldiers whose mere advance had decided battles across 2 decades of war. As the evening light began to fade, with the Prussians pressing his flank and his army spent everywhere else, the Emperor resolved to play it. He would send the Imperial Guard up the slope against Wellington's center right, in one last throw to break the British line before the Prussian tide became irresistible. It was the supreme crisis of the battle, of the campaign, of the age. And the ground over which that final attack would be decided lay just behind and beside the smoking ruin of Hougoumont, the farm that, after 7 hours, the Guard still held. It was near 7:30 in the evening when the Imperial Guard began to climb. The light was going. The battlefield was a vast bank of smoke lit orange where Hougoumont and Plancenoit burned. And across the trampled valley the survivors of both armies were near the end of what men can endure. And now, out of the smoke at the bottom of the slope, came the columns that had decided the wars of a generation. Several battalions of the Middle Guard, the bare-skinned veterans of the Emperor's own household infantry, advanced in echelon up the slope toward Wellington's right center, drums beating the pas de charge, Napoleon himself riding part way up with them before turning the lead over to Ney. Word had gone along the French line that these were fresh troops come to finish the victory, and a great shout had gone up. En avant, la garde! The Guard had never been beaten. Every man on that field, French and Allied alike, knew it, and marked where they had to go. The Imperial Guard's advance came up the slope on the western side of the field, across ground hemmed in, on its left, by the smoking enclosure of Hougoumont, still held by the British. That farm, after 8 hours, was still doing its work. Its loopholes still covered the ground beside them. The defenders still poured fire into the flank of any French force that strayed too near. The very persistence of Hougoumont helped to channel and constrict the final attack, squeezing the Guard's columns onto a frontage where Wellington's prepared infantry were waiting, and denying the French the clean, broad approach they needed. The cork in the bottle was shaping the last act of the battle even now. Wellington had spent the day reading ground better than any man alive, and he read it one final time. Along the crest, on the reverse slope where the French could not see them, he had a line of British infantry lying down, among them the 1st Foot Guards, the very regiment whose light companies had fought all day in the orchard of Hougoumont. They lay in the trampled rye, out of sight, while the artillery on the ridge tore great lanes through the advancing French columns, and the Imperial Guard closed the last 100 yards, believing the crest ahead of them all but empty. It was not empty. As the leading French column breasted the rise, Wellington, by the account that became legend, gave the order himself. "Now, Maitland, now's your time!" And the British Guards rose up out of the ground. They came to their feet at a range of a few dozen paces, a wall of men suddenly standing where there had been only smoke and empty crest, and they leveled their muskets into the head of the French column and fired. The first volley, delivered at point-blank range into a dense formation, was annihilating. The front of the Imperial Guard's column simply collapsed. Volley followed volley, fast and disciplined, the rolling fire of troops who had been held back fresh for exactly this moment, smashing into men who could barely deploy to reply. The head of the column staggered, crumpled, and could not get forward. For a few moments the impossible hung in the balance, and then it happened. The thing no soldier in Europe had ever expected to see. The Imperial Guard wavered. The Imperial Guard fell back. The Imperial Guard broke. And along the French line, the men who had been told these were fresh troops bringing victory saw instead the unbeaten Guard recoiling down the slope in disorder. A cry of horror went up that was, in its way, the death sentence of the Empire. La Garde recule! The Guard retreats. If the Guard could be broken, nothing could be held. The shock ran through the exhausted French army like a crack through ice. Wellington saw it too. He had spent the whole day on the defensive, husbanding, holding, enduring, waiting for this exact instant when the French effort finally spent itself. Now, with the Imperial Guard streaming back and the Prussians biting ever deeper into the eastern flank, he rode to the crest of his ridge, took off his hat, and waved his whole battered line forward. The endurance test was over. After 9 hours of holding, the army that had absorbed everything Napoleon could throw at it rose from its ridge and went on to the attack. And on the far right, as the general advance began, the men of Hougoumont, those still on their feet among the burning buildings and the heaps of dead, could at last look out from their walls and see the French not coming on, but going back. What followed the breaking of the Imperial Guard was not a retreat. It was a collapse. An army is held together by belief as much as by discipline, and the belief that held Napoleon's army together had just died on the slope in front of Wellington's Guards. The cry of "La Garde recule" ran down the line, and behind it came a second, more terrible realization. The Prussians, who had been a rumor on the eastern horizon all afternoon, were now pouring onto the field in strength, driving in from Plancenoit, swinging round toward the rear. The French soldier who looked to his right saw the unbeaten Guard streaming back in ruin. The soldier who looked to his left saw fresh enemy columns closing on his only line of escape. The two shocks met in the middle of the army and dissolved it. As Wellington's line came down off the ridge, the whole battered length of it, infantry and cavalry and guns, The men who had stood all day now finally let loose. The French army came apart into a fleeing mass. Formations that had fought with magnificent courage for 9 hours ceased to exist as formations. Guns were abandoned in the mud. The road south choked with men throwing away their packs and muskets to run faster. Only a few squares of the old guard, the very last of the emperor's household, refused to break. They formed their hollow boxes amid the rout and retreated slowly, bristling, firing, dying where they stood rather than surrender. And around them the wreck of the Grande Armée streamed away into the dusk. Somewhere in that ruin, the Emperor of the French was hustled away by his staff, his last battle lost, his second reign already over. Within weeks he would surrender himself to a British warship and sail into a final exile from which he would never return. And in the center of the field, in the gathering dark, the two victorious commanders met, Wellington and Blücher, the Englishman who had held all day, and the old Prussian who had kept his promise to come, found each other near a farm on the Brussels road called La Belle Alliance, the Beautiful Alliance, a name the chroniclers could hardly have improved upon. By most accounts, it was Blücher who proposed it as the name for the victory. They had between them done what all of Europe had failed to do for 20 years. They had beaten Napoleon in the field and finished him for good. The Prussians, fresher than the exhausted Anglo-Allied troops, took up the pursuit through the night and never let the French reform. Now go back one last time to Hougoumont, because for the men inside those walls, the end of the battle came not as a charge or a climax, but as a strange and sudden silence. For 9 hours their world had been the wall, the loophole, the next French rush, the fire at their backs. They had measured the day not in grand movements, but in cartridges and casualties, and the endless renewal of the decision to hold. And then, in the evening, the pressure simply lifted. The assaults stopped coming. The blue masses in front of the farm were no longer pushing forward, but melting away. The men at the loopholes, half deaf, blackened with powder and smoke, looked out over a foreground heaped with the dead of both armies, and understood, slowly, that it was over, and that they were still there. What they walked out into when they finally came out from behind the walls is almost beyond description. The buildings they had defended were burning shells, the courtyards, the orchard, the wood. The open ground in front of the garden wall were carpeted with bodies, thousands of them, French and British and German. The harvest of a whole day's fighting compressed into a few acres. The wounded lay among the dead in numbers no one could count. Among the ruins still stood the scorched little chapel and the section of wall the guards had never given up. They had held a farm that an empire had spent itself trying to take, and the cost of it lay all around them in the firelight. Of the garrison that had defended the buildings and the gates, only a remnant was unhurt. Macdonell had come through. James Graham had come through. Many of those who had loopholed the walls that wet morning had not. But the light companies of the Brigade of Guards still held the ground they had been given at dawn. And over that ground, the battle that ended Napoleon's empire had been decided. The farm had done what it was placed there to do, and far more. The only thing left was to reckon what it had all meant. Morning came to Hougoumont, and showed what the firelight had mercifully hidden. The 19th of June dawned over a field that the men who survived it would struggle for the rest of their lives to describe. Across the whole battlefield lay something on the order of 40,000 dead and wounded men, and thousands of horses, strewn over a few square miles of Belgian farmland. The wounded had lain out all night in the wet, French and British and Prussian together, their cries carrying across the dark. The looters had been out among them too, the human scavengers who follow every army. And nowhere on that whole dreadful field was the harvest denser than in the small compass of Hougoumont, where the dead were piled in the orchard and the wood and against the garden wall, and the building still smoked, and the burnt remains of the wounded who had not been dragged clear lay in the ruins of the barns. It is worth being exact about the scale, because exactness is the only honest tribute. The struggle for this one farm, a cluster of buildings, a garden, an orchard, a wood, had consumed something on the order of 6,000 to 7,000 casualties of both armies over the course of the day. Napoleon had committed the better part of 14,000 men to taking it, and never succeeded. The garrison that denied it to him numbered, at its core, a fraction of that. The arithmetic that had looked like an insult at 11:30 in the morning looked by the next dawn like one of the most lopsided bargains in the history of war. A few thousand defenders had absorbed and broken the effort of an entire wing of the French army, and held. The survivors set about the grim work that follows every battle. The dead of Hougoumont were gathered and burned, or buried in the orchard and the fields around, so many that the ground itself was changed by them. The chapel, scorched and battered, still stood. The walls the guards had loopholed still stood, pocked with the marks of a day's musketry. And in the regiments, the reckoning of names began. Who had come through? Who had fallen at the loopholes? Who had died in the courtyard fight or the fire? Out of that reckoning, almost at once, something began to crystallize that would outlast every man who fought there. The army understood that what had happened at Hougoumont was special, even by the standard of a battle full of extraordinary deeds. Wellington's verdict, that the success of the battle had turned on the closing of the gates, gave the men of the farm a place in the story of Waterloo that nothing could dislodge. The tale of Macdonell and the gates, of Graham and his brother in the flames, of the garrison that held while the buildings burned, passed straight from the battlefield into the permanent memory of the British Army. It became one of those stories a regiment tells about itself to explain what it is. And here the long arc of this story bends back toward where we began. Because the regiments that held Hougoumont did not vanish into the history books. The Coldstream Guards and the 3rd Foot Guards, who would soon be renamed the Scots Guards, went on. They are with us still. They are among the 5 regiments of foot guards who, to this day, mount the King's Guard at the royal palaces. The same regiments, with the same colors, carrying the same battle honors stitched onto them. And Waterloo is among the proudest of those honors. So the soldier you see standing motionless in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap outside the palace railings, the figure the tourists photograph and try to make laugh, belongs to a regiment that put its shoulder to the gates of Hougoumont. The stillness is not theater. It is the surface of an institution with a very long memory, one that runs back through every campaign to mornings like the 18th of June, 1815. When men of these same regiments held a burning farm against an empire and would not let it fall. That is the thread that connects the ceremony to the cost. The bearskin was not always a costume for tourists. It was once worn by men closing a gate with their shoulders, while a giant with an axe tried to break it down. And the discipline that holds a sentry rigid through a long, hot afternoon is the peacetime face of the same quality that held a garrison rigid through 9 hours of fire. Which leaves only the largest question of all. What did the holding of one Belgian farmhouse actually decide? Not just for a battle, but for Europe, and for the age that followed. So we come to the question the whole day has been building toward. Strip away the smoke and the legend and ask it plainly. Did a farmhouse really break an empire? Begin with the battle itself, because the chain of cause and effect is tighter than it first appears. Waterloo was, for Wellington, a problem of time. His entire plan rested on holding his ridge until the Prussians arrived to tip the balance. He did not need to win the morning or the afternoon. He needed not to lose them. Every hour he survived intact was an hour closer to Blücher, and the battle was therefore decided less by any single charge than by which anchor points of his line held and which gave way, and for how long. Now lay the two farms side by side one last time. La Haye-Sainte in the center fell in the early evening, and its fall nearly lost Wellington the battle, opening a gap through which, with fresh troops, Ney might have broken the Allied line at its most exhausted moment. That is the proof, written in the center of the field, of what the loss of a strong point could do. Hougoumont, on the right, did not fall, and because it did not, the right of Wellington's line never came apart, and the 14,000 Frenchmen sent to take it were kept out of the decisive fighting elsewhere all day long. The farm that held and the farm that fell are the controlled experiment of Waterloo. They tell you as clearly as history ever tells you anything, that the holding of these positions was not a sideshow to the battle. It was the battle. This is what Wellington meant, and he was not a sentimental man, when he said the success of the day turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. He was not awarding a medal. He was making a cold, professional judgment about cause and effect. Had the gates stayed open in the late morning, had the French second wave got into that courtyard, the farm very probably falls before noon. The right flank is turned. The reserves Napoleon poured uselessly into the wood are freed for the center, and the line that bent so dangerously in the evening after La Haye-Sainte might well have broken hours earlier, before a single Prussian had fired a shot. A handful of guardsmen putting their shoulders to a wooden door bought the time on which everything else depended. And on Waterloo, in turn, an age depended. Consider what was actually decided in that Belgian valley on the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon had returned from exile and gambled the future of France and of Europe on one short, violent campaign. The defeat at Waterloo ended it absolutely. Within days he was in flight. Within weeks he had abdicated for the second and final time, and surrendered to the British. Soon after he was on his way to St. Helena, a speck of rock in the South Atlantic, from which he would never return, and where he would die 6 years later. The wars that had convulsed Europe almost without pause for more than 2 decades, that had killed millions, redrawn every border, and made and unmade kingdoms from Madrid to Moscow, came to an end on that field. Waterloo was the last battle of that long age, and it closed it. What came after is the final measure of it. The statesmen who remade Europe after Napoleon built an order intended above all to prevent another general conflagration, and in its essentials it held. The continent would not see another war on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars for almost exactly a century, until 1914. A whole long era of relative peace among the great powers, the century in which Britain rose to the height of its global power, opens on the far side of Waterloo. Historians will argue forever about how much weight to put on a single battle in all of that, and they are right to argue. Great events have deep causes, and no farmhouse, however bravely held, causes a century by itself. But Waterloo was the hinge on which the Napoleonic age finally closed, and the holding of Hougoumont was one of the things that made Waterloo come out as it did. Which returns us, at the very end, to those few minutes at the North Gate. It is one of the strange truths of history that enormous consequences sometimes balance on absurdly small fulcrums, that the fate of empires can, for a moment, rest on whether a handful of exhausted men can force a wooden door shut against the press on the other side. At Hougoumont it did. Napoleon's army laughed at a farmhouse in the morning. By nightfall, the farmhouse was still standing. The imperial guard was broken. The emperor was in flight, and an age of European history was ending in the smoke. The men who shut the gates could not have known any of that as they heaved against the timber. They only knew that the door had to be closed. It was. And an empire never got back through it. 2 centuries have passed, and Hougoumont still stands. If you go to Belgium today and walk south from the low ridge where Wellington's line once lay, you come to it across the same fields. The rebuilt farm, the surviving walls, the orchard, and the small chapel that the fire could not finish. The buildings have been restored. A memorial stands to the men who died there. On a quiet morning, it is an ordinary, peaceful place. Birdsong, old brick, the wind in the trees. You have to stand a while and let the quiet work on you before the imagination can put back what was here. The smoke, the screaming, the wall of muskets, the giant with the axe, the gates heaving shut. It is hard to believe that this small, still place was once the most fought-over patch of ground in Europe, and that the history of a continent paused for a few minutes on whether its north gate could be closed. But the truest memorial to Hougoumont is not in Belgium at all. It stands every single day outside the royal palaces of London. Because the regiments that held that farm were never disbanded, never forgotten, never allowed to fade into the past. The Coldstream Guards and the Scots Guards, the old 3rd Foot Guards, and their brothers in the Brigade of Guards march on, unbroken from that day to this. They are among the 5 regiments of foot guards who mount the King's Guard at Buckingham Palace and Windsor. The scarlet tunic, the bearskin cap, the rigid, silent discipline that draws the tourist and their cameras. All of it belongs to an institution whose memory runs straight back through every campaign of 200 years, to a burning farmhouse on the 18th of June, 1815. This is the thing worth carrying away, the thread that connects the spectacle to the substance. When you see that sentry standing motionless in the heat, ignored or mocked or photographed by a crowd that has no idea what he represents, you are not looking at a costumed performer. You are looking at the living end of a line that includes the men who put their shoulders to the gates of Hougoumont. The stillness people find so strange is not emptiness. It is discipline, the same quality, worn in peacetime, that once held a garrison together through 9 hours of fire when every human instinct screamed at them to break and run. The bearskin is not a hat for tourists. It was earned in places like that orchard, against odds like those, by men like Macdonell and Graham. We began with a French officer laughing across a valley at a farmhouse, certain it would be brushed aside before lunch. We end with the same regiments standing guard over a kingdom 2 centuries later, their battle honors stitched in gold. Waterloo among the proudest of them. Between those two images lies everything this story has been about. The gap between what a thing looks like and what it is. A farmhouse that looked like a nuisance and proved to be the hinge of a battle. A diversion that became an obsession. A handful of ordinary men who looked like they could not possibly hold, and held. And a silent soldier outside a palace who looks like decoration, and is in fact the heir to all of it. The men who closed the gates could not see the future they were buying. They could not know that an empire was ending, that a century of peace was opening, that 200 years on their regiments would still stand, and their deed would still be told. They only knew that the door had to be shut, and that it was their job to shut it. They did the thing in front of them, as well as it could be done, and let history take care of the rest. Perhaps that is the real lesson of Hougoumont, and of the men who guard the palaces still. That the great hinges of history are very often held by people doing an ordinary duty extraordinarily well, asking no one to notice and expecting no one to understand. The farmhouse still stands. So do they. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to Tales of the King's Guard. In every video, we go behind the scarlet and the silence to uncover the real history of the regiments that guard the British crown, the battles that forged them, the traditions that define them, and the men beneath the bearskin. Next, we cross from the mud of Belgium to a freezing hillside in the South Atlantic, where in 1982, the Scots Guards fixed bayonets in the darkness and climbed straight into the guns of Mount Tumbledown, one of the last great bayonet charges the British Army ever made. The regiments are the same, the courage is the same, only the war has changed. Until then, stand your post.